Good day, everyone, and welcome to Supporting Farmer Livelihoods. Research Partnerships for Action is the full title. My name is Brian Dale, and I am a postdoctoral fellow associated with the University of Toronto's Culinaria Research Center, and I'm the project manager for Feeding the City, Pandemic and Beyond project. First of all, I wanted to mention that we have simultaneous translation available for this webinar, so if you'd like to listen in French, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen where it says Interpretation and select Français. Je me répète en français maintenant. Si vous désirez écouter le webinaire en français, nous vous invitons à cliquer sur l'icône Interprétation en bas de votre écran et sélectionner la langue française. Merci. Before I say more, I would like us to acknowledge the Indigenous lands that we are inhabiting, wherever we are across Turtle Island and perhaps beyond. Personally, I have been living and working on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit. I invite us all to think about the land that we're inhabiting and to reflect on the fact that such land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process. This is particularly true in terms of the food system, and without a doubt, the Canadian food and agricultural systems would not be what they are today if it were not for past and present settler colonialism, which continues to prevent true food sovereignty from being realized among Indigenous communities and beyond. In the various roles we have in relation to the food system, let's continuously reflect on relationships of land, peoples, power, and intersectional struggles for equity, and act to dismantle settler colonialism in whatever ways possible. I think that at least one of our speakers will touch on some of these topics today, and perhaps we can discuss further in the discussion period as well. Before I give an overview of today's webinar, I wanted to note that this public session is being recorded and that everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording by email at a later date, likely pretty soon, within a week, I think. It will be Amanda Di Battista and Heather Reed who will be responsible for getting that email out to you. And I just want to thank them for their work in organizing this webinar and to note that they're busy behind the scenes supporting with the chat, with the slides, and with the Q&A moderation. So thank you so much to Heather and Amanda. This webinar is brought to you by FLEDGE. FLEDGE, which stands for Food Locally Embedded, Globally Engaged, is a SSHRC-funded research project that includes more than 90 researchers and community partners in Canada and around the world. Through research with communities, practitioners, and policymakers, FLEDGE and its partners work together to create transformative, sustainable food systems that are socially just, support local economies, are ecologically regenerative, and foster citizen engagement. And in addition, we share our co-generated knowledge through local and global networks. So this webinar is the latest in the FLEDGE Good Food Solutions webinar series, and it's a great example of this knowledge sharing. Today's webinar is in fact based on our good food principle about farmer livelihoods, where we start with the people growing our food. So given that there are 30% fewer farms in Canada than there were in 1961, and that the average age of farmers is about 55, we need to think not only about how to make farming more viable for existing farmers, but also more attractive as a career for prospective entrants. FLEDGE research provides some directions forward. I'll share some of this work. To share some of this work, I'm pleased to welcome our panelists and introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. So first off, we're going to have Charles Legault. Charles is the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Food Systems, the director of the Sustainable Food Systems Lab, and an associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences at Lakehead University. He's also worked with the Northern Node of FLEDGE, as well as the Agroecology and Food Systems Governance Working Groups. Charles will be speaking about a 3-day agroecology field school and research summit that took place in the Ottawa area in the summer of 2018, as well as some scholarly work that came out of that event. Secondly, we are going to have Peter Andre and Louise Livingstone. Louise Livingstone coordinated the farm organization Harvest Hastings from 2009 to 2020, and Peter Andre is a professor at Carleton University. They will speak about a project that brought community members and organizations together between 2016 and 2019 to examine the history and future of farming in Hastings County, Ontario, considering the many economic and environmental challenges, as well as opportunities that the sector is facing. Third, we will have Teresa Shumalas and David Thomas from the Open Food Network Canada. Teresa is a food systems researcher and an organic farmer who's been studying the digital farm gate since 2017. David is a sustainability and food systems researcher with a background in community support, and he joined Open Food Network Canada in 2020 as projects manager. Teresa and David will be sharing Open Food Network Canada's research on the emerging digital farm gate ecosystem in Canada and discussing the challenges and opportunities that farm-to-fork platforms present for farmers and community food initiatives. And then finally, we will have a response from the National Farmers Union's Bess Legault. And I want to say thanks in passing to the NFU, who along with Feeding the Cities project team supported and promoted this webinar. Great to have them on board. I'm biased because I'm a member of the NFU and a non-farmer member. Bess Legault, who will be doing that discussion, leading that discussion portion, is a first-generation farmer and the owner-operator of Hip Peace Produce in BC's Peace River Valley. She grows fruit, vegetables, and herbs using regenerative agricultural practices. And in addition to coordinating a Northern Farmer Support Program called the Northern Cohort, she is the women's president for the National Farmers Union, the NFU. Bess will be telling us more about her experiences as she responds to the three presentations we'll be hearing in order to kick off our discussion. So with no further ado, we will get going with Charles Leveco's presentation. I believe that we will be just taking a moment to get a slide organized for Charles, and I will leave it up to you to take it away, Charles, when you're ready. Thanks.
I am ready, and I'm going to share my slides. I think that's the plan, right? Okay, can folks see this?
We see it, thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to jump into it. And I'll just start by saying that this presentation is based on, as Brian mentioned, an event that, collaborative event that was run a field school in the summer of 2018, AGROECOLOGY Field School and Research Summit, and most recently on a paper that Brian Dale, Julia LaForge, and Faraz Ahmed published in the Journal of Rural Studies in 2021. So I'm going to be touching on a bit of that. So if folks are interested, you can find more on that paper in that journal, and we can provide those links down the road. So I want to start by saying agroecology and food sovereignty have really gained a significant foothold in the global south. However, in the global north, there are some significant challenges that are really hindering its adaptation. And drawing on, again, these presentations and discussions from the participants that participated, that were part of this AGROECOLOGY Field School and Research Summit, I want to spend some time just exploring some of the key elements necessary for the expansion of what agroecology in Canada might look like. So I'm going to start this presentation with a really kind of brief overview of food production, harvesting in Canada, talk a bit more about the field school, and then I'm going to focus on three key dimensions that emerged from again, some of those presentations and discussions of all the participants. Okay. Oh, and I should say Kath Clark from Seed Change took most of these pictures, and I think Brian might have done the original outline of this presentation. So lots of thanks to all the people who helped put this together. So first off, growing and raising and harvesting food in Canada is now, I think, as many of you might already know, is solidly embedded in the capitalist food system. So the processes associated with the kind of industrialization rely heavily on fossil fuels, chemical inputs, cheap labor, and technologies that are really tied to a kind of export-oriented productivist model of food production and harvesting. Capitalist social relations externalize the social environmental costs of food system, really leading to an ongoing theft of land from Indigenous people, diet-related diseases, precarious unsafe working conditions for farmers and farm workers, damage to soils, water, air pollution, biodiversity loss, and the list goes on. And I think this has really resulted in kind of these negative impacts in the quality of life of rural communities, socioeconomic inequalities, and ecological damage. So many of the major challenges with agriculture and fishing are really the direct result of colonial legacies, corporate concentration within food systems, industrial productivist logics, and then the political barriers that really continue to block those initiatives that would build more sustainable food systems. So as this corporate productivist logic increases the control of the food system in Canada, the democratic processes that determine how food is produced and harvested become severely undermined. So agroecology really presents a different way of bringing food to people that is rooted in much more ecological and cultural relationships, appropriate technologies, and sustainable livelihoods. So these approaches are really rooted in the experiences of primarily Indigenous and peasant farmers from around the world, and are intricately linked to food sovereignty. And the realization of agroecology really demands tackling a whole variety of political, economic, social, and environmental challenges in a much more integrated and systematic way. So despite food sovereignty being embraced in some food and farming circles in Canada, as I mentioned in the beginning, the implementation of agroecology does remain quite limited. So we really asked this question at the bottom of your screen here in our paper, and as part of the field school work, is what would it mean to realize and promote agroecology in Canada? So given that agroecology is really based on horizontal sharing of knowledge, we adapted our research methods to kind of gather the information that made up the paper. And in this project to rooted in a kind of participatory democratic process of knowledge sharing that are really part of what we think of as a food sovereignty research praxis. To explore the future of agroecology in Canada, we organized this 3-day agroecology field school and research summit in Ottawa area in the summer of 2018. It was held on the unceded territory of the Algonquin, and it was an interactive knowledge and skill sharing event that really brought together farmers and harvesters, researchers, social movement activists, nonprofit organizations, and Indigenous leaders. It was organized by a network of individuals and organizations that were active in agroecology and food sovereignty research and practice. And just some of the logos of the folks who helped us put this thing together are on the screen. And I think this type of gathering with such diverse and broad participation is really rare, and thus really provided us with a unique opportunity to assess some of these questions about the future of what agroecology in Canada might look like. So again, drawing on the presentations and conversations from the event, I want to switch now and I want to share 3 of the kind of key dimensions, and these are emerging themes that came out of our discussions for expanding agroecology in Canada.
Charles, sorry to interrupt. Before you get into the dimensions, can I just remind you to please speak a bit more slowly for our interpreters?
Yeah,
I know.
Excited. I can't control myself.
I know, and I have to struggle to keep people on time and ask them to speak slowly. So.
No problem.
Sorry.
So food systems governance is really fraught with complex power dynamics that tend to limit the participation of people and communities that produce and harvest food. So agroecology has the potential to connect and strengthen the governance of the Canadian food system along kind of 2 key fronts that came out of our discussion. So first, government level policies, programs, and services. So agroecology requires coordination between various branches of government with policy measures not being limited to just those departments that address specific food and agricultural issues. So for example, we need to look across departments, government policies that kind of reinitiate institutional support for public and participatory plant breeding, revising labor laws to ensure migrant worker justice, transforming supply management systems to encourage new entrants, prioritizing both localized food consumption, fair trade practices at the same time, and also increasing funding for training of agroecology, especially for young farmers and new entrants. So the second area of governance engagement that we heard from people was that agroecology must continue to be grounded in the experiences of communities. So agroecology has progressed in Canada despite, and this is important, despite the overall lack of government support. So in this context, the adaptation of kind of feminist, anti-racist, decolonial approaches were identified as being key to advancing agroecology in Canada. So, just as an example, with the government of Canada recently announcing this food policy for Canada, the first in 2019, there's an opportunity for agroecology proponents to intervene in food systems governance. So the second major theme that came out of the field school was this idea of building networks of solidarity. So advancing agroecology in Canada requires, again, strengthening partnerships through these kind of networks of diverse actors. And this is this kind of idea of networks of solidarity. So people talked about stronger ties being built between nonprofits, researchers, practitioners, looking at the vastness of diversity of Canada's geography really require that agroecology and agroecological science and practice be very specific and targeted. So just as an example, soil conditions, weather patterns, ecological interactions, market conditions can vary dramatically, even within a single region. So it's essential that a holistic agroecological approaches be developed through collaboration and that are sensitive to socio-ecological dynamics of a given place. And I think furthermore, advancing agroecology in Canada really needs to be attuned to those power dynamics associated with the academic and non-governmental institutions, right? So for example, we need to be aware of the kind of bureaucratization that happens of social movements as they become dominated by nonprofits, right? So this idea of NGOization, which can often result in the depoliticization or of kind of discourses and practices. And thus, I think solidarity efforts need to be intimately tied to struggles to democratize and decolonize food systems. And this brings us to our third and final kind of theme that emerged from the discussions. And this is that in the Canadian context, one of the most significant dimensions of agroecology movement is overcoming historical and ongoing injustices within and beyond the food system, particularly as they relate to Indigenous people. So since Canada's current food system is built on the foundations of settler colonialism and white supremacy, we need to understand and confront the continuing and systemic forms of oppression that are deeply embedded and inherent in that system. So from treaty violations to ongoing threats from mining, hydroelectric projects, recreational activities that toxify Indigenous lands and waters, and that limit access of Indigenous people to traditional lands and food systems. So in short, developing agroecology in Canada requires addressing questions of sovereignty and land in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. So many of the contributors to the Indigenous panel, one of the many kind of ways Indigenous folks were engaged in the field school, the idea came up that Indigenous culture has contributed to agroecology through both agricultural practices and traditional food provisioning, including things like fishing, hunting, gathering forest and freshwater foods. So one of the participants, Sherry Pickdow, who many of you know, a Mi'kmaq woman from Bear River First Nations, observed that agroecology actually is, and this is a quote, agroecology is an Indigenous way of thinking. She talked about, so she argued that agroecology needs to confront the view that humans are separate or superior to nature, and that food is a commodity for profit making. Second, that Byron Beardy, who's you see in the picture there with a microphone, an OG Cree health promoter, stressed that Indigenous worldviews on the relationality of food can complement efforts towards participatory governance, solidarity, and knowledge sharing. In short, just to summarize this point and move on, Indigenous ways of knowing must be understood as central to the advancement of agroecology and not an afterthought to be considered parenthetically. So I'll just I want to finish here with just some very brief concluding thoughts, and that is that as a radical alternative to the capitalist industrial system of food provisioning, agroecology really has the potential to transform Canada's food system to be more equitable, healthy, and sustainable. Now, challenges inhibiting the realization of agroecology are, in fact, deeply political. Proponents of agroecology in Canada are often tempted to present less provocative ideas and proposals in order to gain wider support. But in doing so, we argue that they really risk undermining their own efforts for greater transformation. So in short, and just to end, I want to say, building on these three dimensions of agroecology that we presented here, the future of agroecology, as a way to realize and promote the future of agroecology in Canada, we realize that agroecology is intricately tied to food sovereignty struggles, and incremental reforms are really going to be inadequate in shifting Canada's food system to the extent that it is needed. So that's the end. I hope I spoke slow enough and clear enough. There is a report on the FLEDGE website if folks want to access that on the field school. And of course, this is the article, just the image of the article, which I'll put in the chat box as soon as I stop talking so people can see it. Thank you so much, Charles. Really appreciate it. Yes, and you did indeed slow down, even though it's an exciting topic, and thanks for that. I was there obviously at the event, as you mentioned, and so I wanted to say thanks for nicely articulating the insights that came out of it, and for reminding us, those of us who were there, and for informing those who weren't, of what a special experience that was for folks to come together. I think it's pretty rare that we get those experiences where so many diverse actors, Indigenous leaders, farmers, scholars, and so on come together from kind of across the food system and across kind of our interaction with the food system on a regular basis, which is normally quite isolated. I see that questions have started coming in via the Q&A, and so this is a perfect opportunity for me just to remind folks that as you're listening to the next two presentations and also Bess's responses to all three of them, please feel free to ask questions that will help us kick off our discussion later. We will try to get to as many questions as we can in the discussion period, and we will be looking primarily at the Q&A as opposed to the chat for questions that are coming in. So yeah, please, as they come to you, don't feel like you have to wait. Just feel free to put in questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. Okay, next up, I want to turn it over to Peter Andre from Carleton University and Louise Livingston from Harvest Hastings, and I believe they'll just take a second as well to get a presentation shared with you.
I'm trying, but Louise will be speaking first. So let's see if I can get rid of this. Are you now seeing some slides?
We see the slides. Thanks. Yeah.
Excellent. And Louise will speak first. So
yeah. Louise, you're muted at the moment.
Hello. Thank you, everybody. This looks as if it's going to be a really interesting session. Peter and I are going to talk about the future of farming in Hastings County research and the benefits of this community university partnership. As you can see here, it was a partnership between Carleton, a partnership between Carleton, FLEDGE, and Harvest Hastings. Can I have the next slide, Peter? Okay. I'm going to give some background, and Peter is going to talk about the process and the research results. And then I'm going to talk about the things that have come out of the research and some of the lessons we've learned. Harvest Hastings started about 10 years ago when farmers were thinking about the future. They decided that there was no point in protecting farmland without protecting and supporting farmers in the rural community. From this, we set up the Harvest Hastings website, harvesthastings.ca, and the farmers can post profiles and highlight their products. It was a time of the 100-mile diet, and our tagline at that stage was Know Your Farmer. The website has continued for 10 years, and now we get about 1,000 visitors a month in the summer months. 1,000 visitors a week in the summer months. As you can see here, Hastings County is halfway between Ottawa and Toronto, and it's one of the second largest county in Ontario. And as such, it's very, very diverse, running from the Bay of Quinte, where we can grow soft fruit and apples, right up to Algonquin, where it's jack pine and moose. Lots of changes have been happening in the county over the last 10, 15 years, as farmers have moved from dairy farming because of all the regulations about small farms into cash cropping, partly for ethanol and to beef. But at the same time, there's a whole range of producers of niche products from water buffalo mozzarella to emu. Fairly early on, we decided that we need to get a much better handle, get a comprehensive report on what was happening that could guide us. This wasn't something that we could do by ourselves. So I was delighted to meet with Peter Andre, and he was able to get funding and set up a research team to help us with this research. And I'm going to hand over to Peter now. Can we hand over to Peter?
Here I come. You can hear me okay, Louise?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So thank you for starting us off. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process, what we did, and some of our findings and recommendations, and then pass it back to Louise to talk more about how this research was implemented in Hastings County. So this was a process over about 3 years. It was supported through the Fledge project that is doing this webinar today. And the main financial support was really to help hire a research assistant who was Kim Bitterman, a PhD student at Carleton. She undertook 30 interviews, over 30 interviews. It was closer to 40, primarily with farmers from around Hastings County, but also with representatives of various organizations and various levels of government that all have a stake in the future of farming in Hastings County. We also undertook 6 community meetings or workshops. At one of these, we had Ken Meter, an agricultural economist from Minnesota, who works a lot on community-based food systems right across the United States. He came and gave a pretty exciting slideshow to the community in Madoc about projects across the United States where farmers had switched essentially from productivist big cash cropping operations to figuring out how they can better feed their own communities. And then the next day, Ken and I and Kim, I think we all went to present at County Council in Hastings to share some of the insights from the meeting of the evening before. We also did several workshops in both the north and south of the county where we presented preliminary results and had community input and feedback. And then finally, we had a couple of action-oriented meetings towards the end of this project where we brought stakeholders from across the community together, Federation of Agriculture, Economic Development of County Council and of cities, to talk about how we could better work together to support agriculture in Hastings County. We did a very deliberately an asset-based approach, and you can see a link on this slide, and maybe I can put it in the chat box afterwards, to the Community Economic Development Network's Asset Mapping Handbook. And this was a really simple toolkit for, once we had preliminary research results, we could bring it to the community and talk about what are the assets, as you see, natural, economic, social, infrastructure, abattoirs, and so on that support sustainable farming in this county, and what are the threats to that? How do we preserve and build on this infrastructure moving forward? A couple of key things to note: we had lots of collaborators in this project, and that's pretty critical if you want to move from research to action. And we really centered farmer voices and farmer experiences, looking back over the history of what they've done in the county and how they see themselves moving forward. And that really produced a certain level of authority in the results that we have, and also buy-in within the farm community. I will touch very quickly on some research results because I know time is moving quickly. We developed a sort of a typology of different types of farmers we saw active in the county, and how their strategies for survival, from the adaptive farmers who are to entrepreneurs working in value added and diversified, more selling to local markets or to Toronto markets, to a third category, which was heritage farmers, who are perhaps farming is not their primary income on the farm, but they're really committed to the land, family, a farming lifestyle, and face many of the same economic and sustainability challenges as the other two types of farmers. And we really looked at this as a farm community as a whole, and really recognizing that all of these farmers need to work together, even though they might have different ideological positions and maybe different perspectives on something like agroecology. They're part of the farm community together and have to figure out how to support one another. You're welcome to look at the report on the website. I won't go through the other research results. We did do some interesting economic data crunching. This was done by Ken Meter from Minnesota, and that picture on the bottom right just shows you how we could unpack how the economics of farming in the southern part of the county, which is the bottom left of that diagram, was quite different from the upper part, and then that also changed over time, which are those three different pillars. So it's all in the report. Out of this research, we developed a series of recommendations. We realized that, of course, we could be targeting recommendations to the federal government, but there's also a place for local government and local community organizations to grab hold of some of what's needed to be done. And so, just as examples, we regularly mental health was something that really came up through the farmer interviews as something that needs to be grappled with as we deal with the economic crisis in agriculture. There's a need to review local regulations through a small business lens to make sure that small farmers that are trying to take a more entrepreneurial approach are not getting systematically harmed. There's a place for county and city government to develop a core mission around supporting community-based food system development. And then just a little tag for the next presentation is up. There's quite a bit of discussion about virtual food hubs and e-marketing of foods, which really, as we all know, has taken off in the context of the pandemic. So there's a link to the report there. Again, I'll put that into the chat box afterwards, and I'll pass it back to Louise to finish off with the last two slides.
Hi. Progress to date. Well, obviously COVID has put a big break on a whole lot of things, but despite that, a number of things have been happening. The local Federation of Agriculture has set up a counselling service to promote farmer mental health, so farmers can get tools to assess their state of mental health and also get counselling. As we're going to hear with the next presentation, online stores and e-commerce has really taken off. Harvest Hastings, we have put in funding to do a centralised store, which we didn't get, but a lot of our producers got funding, and there has been a big growth in farm gate ordering, farm gate pickup, delivery, farmers working together with mixed boxes and so on, and also beginning now with food trucks, because you can do the social distancing and so on. There's work on supporting the local abattoirs and maybe getting a federal abattoir. You know, we're lucky, but it's obviously a big issue, which is linked to what's happening with the big food meat packing plants and so on. Ray, the website, we've set up a digital storytelling archive, and with the new site, it's going to be directly linked into producers' online stores. One thing that's happening, which is interesting, I think, is the Quinty Farm Research and Stewardship Collaborative, which is a link between Toronto, U of T, the conservation authorities, soil and crop and farmers. And it is looking at ways of improving soil health and water quality, reducing fertilizer inputs, and looking at ways of reducing nutrient loss. So that's an interesting new collaborative. Zoom has absolutely opened up opportunities for learning for everybody, but COVID has meant that there's a huge lack of social interaction. So the various groups can't get together and eat together. And so that's having a big threat. The health unit, the Hastings Prince Edward Health Unit, we had a new medical officer of health, and they commissioned a community food assessment study, but unfortunately that is on hold at the moment because they're dealing with COVID. Access to land is more and more of a problem because farm prices have shot right up as people are wanting to move out of the city, and the farms at work are looking at ways of you know, making people aware of where land is available and so on. Because a lot of the new people coming in are not farmers, but they want somebody to farm. Labour force issues is another one. The Centre for Workplace Development is looking at this, but agricultural and rural industry doesn't fit into normal labour force type boxes. Anyway, we can go to the next slide, Peter. Looking at things that we've learned from this, I think it's very important to get a clear picture of what's actually happening in your community. And as Peter says, one does this by talking to people, bringing them together. And from a community group, it's really, really helpful to have the academics, the research students helping with this, because they've got the time and the expertise to go out and talk with people and so on. And as Peter was saying, the process matters. I think being able to settle down and listen to what people have to say. Kim would go in and spend 2 or 3 hours with the farmer and the family listening to their issues. As Peter said too, the asset-based approach is important because different people have different views of the asset, but once you get together, you can work out what is important and what's at risk, sharing ideas. It was really good bringing in Ken Mater from the States. You can learn from elsewhere, because you can sometimes get a bit too close to the ground in your own area. And building and strengthening collaboration, I think, is important. You're putting different people in contact with each other, because we're all looking at ways of surviving and going into the future in this area. I threw in this idea of sowing seeds, because what I find is that people don't necessarily pick up the ideas straight away. They listen to them and then they hear them from somewhere else, and gradually things begin to change. And the results can be very varied and sometimes very unexpected, but because different people have come at things from different ways, one can get some really exciting things to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. And thanks, Peter. It was a great presentation, and it's great to see some like a practical example of how some very tangible resources from the academic side in terms of research assistant, interviews, organizing workshops, and so on can lead to such great analysis, and then also some kind of practical recommendations that are clearly moving forward. So thanks for sharing that. Looking forward to us discussing that more. I do want to keep us going with the next presentation to try to keep us on time and have a lot of chance for discussion. So next up, I'm going to turn it over to Canada. And again, I believe they're going to be sharing a presentation, so that'll just take a second to get organized. Take it away, Teresa and David. Thanks.
Well, hi, folks. Now we're going to do something a little bit different and move from space on the ground to space in cyberspace here. Are people seeing a slide that says Open Food Network?
Yes, indeed. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So my name's Teresa, and David will be joining me as we go along, and we're going to do a couple things. I hope I don't talk too fast. Just introduce you to Open Food Network, because you probably haven't heard about the project, and talk about this evolving concept that we're calling digital farm gate and what that means, and give you a couple concrete projects that we've been working on. So Open Food Network is actually a global network of not-for-profits working together around the world. There's about 30 of us right now in 15 languages. And Open Food Network Canada is a sister in that project. And thank you to the Centre of Sustainable Food Systems who funded our beginning. So what we do collectively is we are code savers. You've heard of seed savers and the rationale for why we have seed savers. So this is a response to that, to the consolidation of code and the removal of code from control. We think that code is a kind of input into food systems that is essential for food sovereignty if we want to get there. So we see tech sovereignty and food sovereignty as linked. So what we do is we code into open source code that's useful for the food movement. And we started with e-commerce code. And why would we start with e-commerce code? Because it's the code that every farmer or community food initiative or consumer is using every single day when they access food. And so it's the big one. And there's some really unique things about selling food versus selling anything else. And, you know, I'm sure you can imagine them. There's this real-time inventory problems. The stuff is growing in the field. We have large players and small players who mingle together. We have formal and informal economies mingling together. We have all different kinds of products and units being sold, and it has to be traceable and transparent. So these are some unique characteristics of the e-commerce for food. Luckily, people are rising to that call. So lately we have seen a rapid proliferation of often what are called platforms or farm-to-gate platforms that specifically have e-commerce code that is addressing some of those idiosyncrasies for the food system. So that is a very good thing. It is putting new tools and new opportunities to the service of local food systems. However, we think there's another way we need to look at the picture. Who owns this code? Who controls this code? And to what extent can it really be managed by local food system players? And so when we look at that, we see that the vast majority of this code is proprietary owned. We like to say investor owned because it takes a lot of investment to develop code like this. And so there's a lot of investment from players who we might not be so happy about into this code that's happening here. Open Food Network is a little bit different. We're an open source code base. We're owned in the commons. So we started a project to try to ask the question, what happens if we can take these open source tools and really put them into the hands of entrepreneurs in community food systems across Ontario we were working in, and see what they can do with them with our guidance at their side to hack what they need. And Trillium funded this, and we found some very interesting things, and this report is on our website if you want to read the full details. In some communities, particularly mid-sized urban rural mixed kind of communities, communities launched a central hub, a central buyer that organized the supply from, you know, maybe 75 or 85 different kinds of farmers, all in ways that are completely traceable and source identifying, where the farmers tell their stories, etc. But what went further is once that initial hub does that organization, they can enable daughter hubs. So very informal spots that might just be a parking lot, or it might be someone's home, a group of consumers working as a buying club, whatever you could imagine, that become ways to easily access this source identified local food without the administrative cost. And now what we're seeing in these communities is the spinning off of equally large complex hubs that maybe are specializing in different aspects of local food, like more processed or prepare at home food and more raw food, etc. And they all work together and they all share the same resources. A second example that we've seen evolve in more rural communities, this is Huron County in Ontario, is the linking together of laterally distributed systems, often around farmers markets. So in Huron, there's actually 3 other farmers markets that aren't on this picture that are all linked together into a system. So farmers can sell in multiple, there's many different arrangements for payments and many different arrangements for drop spots and deliveries, etc. But what's kind of interesting about Huron, and the reason I showed this particular picture, is they're going further to address local food insecurity by linking the supply from this system into their food bank system, their distribution system there. So what's interesting for us, oh, and I should say, I don't have a slide here, but this is also we modeled some Toronto systems, some larger systems, where the problem is that you have lots and lots of suppliers who want to sell into a big city like that, and lots of consumers who want to purchase local food, but a farmer takes, you know, a third of their margin to sell into Toronto if they're from outside. And so we're working with a group of flower farmers, actually, in the hinterlands outside of Toronto to model a wholesale distribution hub for flowers in the city that's been very successful, and it could be replicated for food as well. So what we found is, surprise, surprise, that if you in fact tech enable entrepreneurial thinkers on the ground in food systems with these tools, they run with them. So 13 entrepreneurs we started with, and we ended with 190 different enterprises linked into systems. So a massive expansion of community and networks there. And of course, improving access to local and sustainable food products. But perhaps most importantly, at least in terms of the theme of this webinar, is in a few months, we returned basically $1 million to the pockets of the local farmers that are supplying these systems. These are ecological growers, artisans, multiple scales, etc. The interesting thing about this for us is this is pre-COVID. So this is before consumers got hooked on buying online. And I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk about a second project we did in response to COVID. David.
Hey, Teresa. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks very much. Oh, I'm just waiting for my farmers market slide there. That's great. So yes, this is, it's a very specific instance of the digital farm gate, I would say, but it's an interesting case because every farmers market potentially embraces so many different kinds of farm or local food enterprise. So there's a lot of complexity at play in every one of these markets. And there's consequently a lot of information to be gained about local food systems and the different kinds of ways of engaging with them. As Teresa's mentioned, this is like COVID rapidly, as everyone knows, accelerated the uptake of e-commerce and the distribution of goods in that way. These were trends that were already in place, but COVID for sure, and the public health restrictions and social distancing measures in particular obviously accelerated demand for this kind of thing. So that's the context in which we began this project. We were approached by Farmers Market Ontario to work with them after they received a government COVID subsidy, basically, to provide e-commerce solutions for local farmers and farmers markets who were obviously really concerned. This is back in March when all the stories are first starting to come out, and March and April when all the stories are first starting to come out of the situation in Italy and etc., other parts of the world, where the risk, I guess, of the pandemic is becoming clear, and where everyone's concern is sort of ramped up to a very high level. So people are really worried about how we're going to distribute our food. Our market's going to be able to open. In the end, more markets actually ended up opening in some capacity other than I think people would have been anticipating at this moment in time. All the same, it led to a lot of interest in this project and many webinars for Teresa and Q&A sessions with local farmers and farmers market managers who are nervous about making this jump but see the need to do it. So in the end, we onboarded somewhere in the region, we onboarded 27 farmers markets, somewhere in the region of 600 vendors over the course of a month in preparation for the farmers market season beginning. And in this case, all the software subscription fees for the farmers are being covered via a COVID relief grant. And so we learned a lot in this short period of time. I think it's true to say that we hadn't worked extensively with farmers markets in the past. That Teresa's sort of presentation there is indicative of the kind of projects that we've been working on previously, which is much more to do with working with a central, more formalized food hub, and connecting up then with multiple suppliers. In the case, and what we learned quickly during the consultation process, was that farmers markets are a different scenario than food hubs very often. One key difference is that farmers markets aren't in the habit of managing, or having a single manager managing sales, inventory, etc. More often, the typical farmers market experience is you go there are multiple vendors, multiple points of sale. So market managers are really reticent to take on this role of being the central. I'm seeing that I've got to sort of wrap this up pretty quickly. Okay, so it's a complex use case and different scenarios in which complex use case and a fundamentally different scenario for farmers, and for the platform. So during the farmers market season, it was a relatively successful sort of project. We sold, I think it was $60,000 worth of product through June, July, and August. And we discovered in that just quickly that the key success factor was the time and organizing capacity of a designated manager. So even when a market wasn't being managed centrally, the key thing really was that you had somebody on the ground that was able to wrangle vendors and do the organizing on the ground. With that kind of person in place, it didn't really matter if we were managing multiple sort of points of sale or a single one. And yeah, the last point I would raise is and perhaps the most significant finding that we had from this project, which was growing competition in the e-commerce space is leading to a scenario where you have multiple platforms competing for the same user base. And this results in these kind of scenarios where potentially you are a farmer distributing through multiple markets in your local area, but perhaps one of the markets has decided to go with local wine, one of them has started to go with Open Food Network. If you're wanting to use the digital channels and sell digitally through these markets, you're faced with potentially having to make a choice between these two platforms because they're not currently what we would call interoperable. So that's what we see coming out of this the Farmers Market project as the kind of as the next step really, and something that Open Food Network is looking at is how it is convening stakeholders to look at interoperability and the ability for platform to automatically manage inventory across multiple different e-commerce platforms. So as a vendor, you would only have to sign up for one platform and thus be able to sell through all of them because of people signing up to open data standards. So yeah, I should conclude right there.
Thank you so much, David and Teresa. Yeah, it's a big project. It's obviously a very timely presentation in terms of everything that's been going on in the last year. And thanks for outlining some of that research and some of that work that you've been doing. These have been three great, different and yet interconnected presentations, and so I'm looking forward to further discussing. And most immediately turning it over to Bess Legault, who's going to respond and just speak about her experiences, reflections on the presentations. Bess, if you'd like to also raise a few, perhaps how you feel they relate to you and your farming experiences, perhaps your work with the NFU or your knowledge of what's going on with other farmers in your area in BC or elsewhere. And of course, yeah, if you want to just let us know how you think some of the insights, I guess, that the various insights at different levels that have been talked about in the three presentations could perhaps be adapted or applied in other contexts. That would be really interesting. And of course, we will get into a Q&A, which we would love to involve you with in afterwards as well. So yeah, any immediate thoughts or responses?
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Brian, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm not gonna lie, my mind is exploding with all kinds of ideas, and how every presentation is touching on to some of the work that I've been exploring here as a first-generation farmer and a community food organizer, trying to shake up some of these ideas in the Peace region of British Columbia. Yeah, so agroecology field school. Wow, I wish I was there. I will mention that Katie Ward, who's the president of the National Farmers Union, she was in attendance, and yeah, I saw some pictures of Ayla Fenton, who's also an active member, and yeah, just what an inspirational opportunity to bring all those stakeholders together. I know with the National Farmers Union, caring about Indigenous solidarity and reconciliation is something that on the board level that we were trying to internally train and make sure that we have a fundamental understanding and respect, and I'm encouraged to include that in all of our work moving forward. So I really appreciate that presentation. Yeah, I know when it comes to that that collaborative piece, it's really important that we bring in partners from all different levels of government and academia, as well as NGOs and farmers to lead the conversation. So I hope to see more work and maybe even use that model so that we can kind of maybe even try that in other provinces of the country, because a lot of the work that I'm seeing done is very relevant to how we're going to shift our food systems, and I know there's a lot of unknowns on how we enact that action and try and encourage farmers to take action. And of course, all the things we're talking about include risk. And so, yeah, it's beautiful to see the combination of examples being put forth in this workshop to show how we can inform ourselves to reduce risk, and then also empower ourselves to be a part of that change on not only on the landscape, but also on the political level as well. Yeah, I'm now looking at myself, and it's little bit strange. So I'm going to change my view here. Here we go. I did write down a couple of notes. I think the project in Hastings is just really, really great to hear about. I know that we've been looking at developing farmer-led research, and I think the key component there is that university piece and bringing in educated youth and people with the skills to be able to do that engagement. I know in our region it tends to be a lot of farmers who are trying to move these agendas and ideas forward, and so those collaborative pieces are really important. So yeah, it's going to encourage me to reach out to our regional academic institutions to see if we can start getting some partnerships together that way. And then also curious about, again, just standing on the shoulders of giants is something that I've used as a motto in all the work that I do. And so really, really grateful for being exposed to the great research that's been done in Ontario. And yeah, can't wait to introduce it to some of the good work that's being done here in British Columbia as well. Online commerce. It's very much so relevant to my world. I am in a rural community. I wear many hats in the food system here. So I'm also the president of our local Fort St. John Farmers Market. I can kind of speak to that open source private versus publicly owned data. I'm not a tech person, so I can't speak too much to that, but I know that there's generally been a lot of confusion. There's been a lot of excitement around the all these apps and programs and platforms available for helping farmers put on that tech hat and connect to consumers on an online platform. The challenge I've kind of noticed in my community is that resistance to be able to adopt those, and just curious about almost that tech literacy piece that you touched on, and actually training farmers in rural communities, because I know that yeah, our farmers market isn't associated with the farmers market of BC, and that's a historical piece that I don't need to go into. So we didn't receive that funding component, and even with that funding component, we run with a volunteer market manager. And so I really that idea of having to wrangle vendors and having to put extra work onto a volunteer market manager, and it just shows the fragility of those types of systems and how they really need to be supported in many ways. So I'm actually really curious to hear a little bit more about that open source networking and code, and how you kind of see that supporting farmers not only in Ontario but maybe across the rest of the country.
Thanks so much. We have a half hour actually to get into questions and to hear responses. Yeah, I appreciate that everyone has, in terms of the 3 presentations, reports and or articles to share, and I think they've all been shared in the chat, so people can dig into the details later. I would, just before we kind of open it up to questions from folks who are attending, and I continue to encourage people to put questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I just wanted to ask anyone who presented as well, I encourage you to either respond to other presentations or things that are top of mind, but also, sorry, I just got to notice that my internet connection was unstable. I'm still here, I think. I would just invite you to also comment on research partnerships in terms of, Charles raised the question of praxis and how research partnerships can help in terms of going both ways. The academy can quite often be quite theoretical and not tuned into what's going on in terms of community work and work on the ground that farmers and others are doing. And these presentations that we've heard are good examples of how some of those barriers can be broken down, which I think is great. But I also wanted to ask you all, and maybe, I don't know, Charles, if you might want to take this one first, talking about agroecology and food sovereignty. These are concepts that often seem abstract and maybe disconnected from the words and or the experiences of people on the ground. And so I just wonder about kind of the other part of praxis in terms of theory informing the on the ground work, as opposed to the opposite, which we've also heard about today.
Yeah, I wanted actually, Brian, to make a comment about something Bess said, but maybe I'll just make a quick comment in response to what you just asked and then say the other thing I wanted to say. And that is, I've been thinking a lot. I've been having a conversation, which is a bit confidential, so I'm not going to say who it was with, but someone probably most people on this meeting know, about the kind of tactics and strategies around agroecology. And the conversation essentially went like, and it was actually about our paper, so we can talk about the details later, but essentially it was a bit of an accusation around the danger of attaching agroecology so directly to social movement work and to the politics of food sovereignty, because at least at the level of government, there is such a resistance to food sovereignty or to that kind of a politics. And I guess it raises the question of, for those of us who are kind of working at some level with the idea of agroecology and trying to find ways to engage in policy and funding and kind of having more kind of reach, there is a real question that I think we need to struggle with in terms of what that looks like from a tactical or strategic perspective and what we attach it to. So while our paper and the presentation argued very strongly that we can't separate agroecology, which of course is a practice, is a science, is a movement, we can't separate it from the politics, and that it is squarely rooted in food sovereignty. I think there is a bigger question about, like, if we want to have sway at the level of government, we need to be cautious, or conscious at least, conscious of how we do that, and what is the best strategic move. I don't know if I have a great answer for it in this short moment, but it is something I think we need to think about. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I'd love to hear others' perspectives on that too, because all of what you're doing, I think, imply or has an impact on that. Is just, Bess, you talked a bit about the field school and some of like the model or the method of the field school in other places. And I think one of the things, I didn't get into this, and I know I don't have time now, but one of the most beautiful things about the field school was having the opportunity to engage with folks, from the NFU, from the academy, from farmers. We had some international folks that we brought over through a grant we got in partnership with Seed Change and other organizations, and to just have a chance to kind of sit together and be in the field, working together and talking about kind of big ideas and practical things in that space. It was a really as I said in the presentation, unique time. And I think this idea of, and this is not something we got into in the paper, but something I'd just like to put on the table, is to think more about the methodology of field school, or the methodology of this kind of farmer to farmer, to academic to and nonprofit learning that happens, building on the kind of campesino model, or the different kind of learning networks that happen in other places. But I think there's a lot of value in that I think we haven't, at least in North America, we haven't explored very well. And it's much more prominent in the global South, especially in Latin America. So yeah, just something to think about, I think, in terms of what methodology looks like in respect to praxis and engagement in terms of pushing these ideas forward.
Thanks very much, Charles. I see Peter's hand raised, so I'll let Peter chime in, and then if any other panelists or Bess want to chime in, then you're also welcome.
I just wanted to say something quickly in relation to the kind of one of the conclusions of the first presentation, Charles, and Brian, you were part of it, where it sounded like you're saying, everyone should adopt the politics of food sovereignty in order to advance agroecology. And that might not have been exactly what you're saying, but I just want to push back on that a little bit by talking about how the project that we did in Hastings County was very deliberately not adopting a particular politics in order to engage the farm community broadly with where they are at, and really think about what does that future look like. We talked to a lot of commodity growers, and nobody said, and the future is in commodity growing, right? They said, we've got big challenges. They all have economic challenges. They're all facing environmental challenges and are looking for new pathways forward. And coming in with ideology up front can be a barrier to having a conversation with everyone. That said, I was at the field school that you organized. I've written on food sovereignty. I agree with a lot of the politics of where you and your co-authors are coming from. I just want to say that I'm not sure it's always the best starting place. It's a conversation that needs to happen among those who are engaged to move that conversation forward. but at a community level, even at a national level, I think we need to work with where people are at to use things like agroecology and food sovereignty to help advance conversations that they're ready to have.
Thanks, Peter. I want to open it up for any comments. Bess, I see your microphone is just unmuted. Yeah, go right ahead.
I was just going to relate that I have a similar experience when I talk about climate change as the forefront for the agricultural or the agroecology practices that I try to promote and endorse on my farm and with other farmers in the area. Moving to oil and gas country and also happened to be 30% of the agricultural land produced in British Columbia. It's this unique dichotomy, and there's certain topics that people just aren't necessarily ready to embrace and to lead the conversation on. That said, that's my perception, assuming that I need to appease everybody else that's not willing to have an uncomfortable conversation. And at some point, we need to be able to bridge the gap between we are where we are right now, and we need to not alienate those that may not see everything fully, but also be able to make sure that we don't lose the fact that we're farmers for climate solutions and that we are farmers who are looking at land reconciliation and you know what I mean. And so I agree, it's probably the biggest challenge of our culture right now, and how we're going to move forward. And I think that it's a challenge not just in agriculture but in a lot of other industries and things as well. So I really appreciate both of those perspectives.
Thanks, Bess. Either David or Teresa or Louise, any other thoughts that you wanted to add to anything you've heard? Or Louise, I see your hand. Go right ahead, and then we'll carry on. You're unmuted. You're muted right now.
Oh, sorry. The tech expert who just got a little baffled. I think there's this thing that you can't be pure in an impure world. And if you try to, you do nothing. So when I look at the tech landscape, it would be fine for me to say all those closed source proprietary solutions are not a good thing, because I don't think they are. And yet I'm a farmer who is marketing on Facebook every single day. Why? Because 40% of my purchases come from that link on Facebook. So I would be shooting my livelihood if I didn't do that. So farmers have to do what's right for them. I think there's a place that says, this is where we are today. This is what's best for me today. But for heaven's sakes, let's build a policy and regulatory environment that's different so that we can be someplace different in 10 years and not the path this is kind of heading us towards. So that's how I personally on my farm reconcile doing things I know are not pure.
Thanks, Teresa. I saw Louise has her hand, but David, maybe you want to just add to that directly?
Yeah, just very quickly, it's on topic, and it's, you know, Bess raised the question concerning uptake in people's reticence, like the interest and the reticence, and that for sure that was the major challenge of our project. Is that the opportunity is there, people see the opportunity, but it's the issue with time and how do you prioritize it? So that's sort of, we came out of that project really with that as one of our questions, like how do we support, how do we find in some sense partners? We're exploring a partnership with a food service educator who did the design courses for sort of selling online and that kind of thing. And so can we find ways to develop courses? And they have an interesting model because it's subsidized through community development networks around Canada. And so that kind of thing, we think, you know, it does potentially require a little hand holding. And so how do we actually develop those resources is for sure a key question for us.
Thanks. Louise, yes.
Can I go back to different farming type systems? What I'm seeing in this area is that all the farmers are dealing with the changing climate and droughts and floods and stuff, whether they're conventionally organic or cash cropping and so on. But I think that there's much more of a coming together. There's a great deal of growing interest in soil health and the use of cover crops, you know, keeping your soil covered. And I keep thinking, you know, the organic people have been doing that for years, but it's coming in. So I don't think I think one has to look at how different people are dealing with the situation we've got and the cash croppers are dealing with fluctuations, economic fluctuations, and as Peter says, that they're looking at different ways of selling locally and so on. But I don't think on the actual the crop husbandry and so on, and the soil management, I think things are coming together much more.
Thanks so much. It's been a great discussion so far, and we still have some time. So I want to just go over to some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. And just to summarize one from Megan Curtis. So Megan had asked about regulations and some of the differences between reviewing regulations as kind of an analytical task versus advocating for regulatory change. Which is tough, and I think it actually relates to all the presentations that we've heard. So I want to turn it over to you all to just hear any additional responses or thoughts about that, particularly in terms of the power relations that are at play, right? And if I can just add, I mean, I think that academics often are in a tough spot in the sense that if they're trying to do community-based research, I know personally as an academic, we are often, not always, but often coming from a place of relative privilege in terms of having a more secure livelihood than many farmers and others within the food system with whom we might be engaging. So any thoughts on some of those tensions around power and regulatory change and analysis versus doing and advocacy? Who would like to go first? Anyone want to jump in on that? Peter, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I'm responding partly because I think Megan wrote this shortly after I talked about the idea of reviewing local policies and regulations from a small business lens. I appreciate what you're saying, Megan, and it's true that the skill set needed to advance and achieve regulatory and policy change is a complex one, and it's not one that farmers or academics typically have or have been trained in. But there are plenty of people trained in our colleges and universities that do have that skill set, in terms of communication strategies and public relations and so on. We have a graduate program at Carleton where I am in political issues management, which is all about, and that's where the people that work in the political parties often go through. So there are, it's just a different, it's for sure, it's a different kind of work. I do want to say that, and Louise can maybe speak to this as well, or others, that doing a research project like ours has provided a footing for some of the organizations like Harvest Hastings and perhaps others in the county and across the province to make the case on certain policy changes and then use the research as part of their backup. And so, I guess I'm just trying to say there is a place also for the kind of work that we were doing, just trying to really understand the landscape and see what's happening. And one of the ways also by making the connection with academics and working with them to develop research appropriate to your community, there's a certain there's a certain cachet to having these different voices come together and work on a project together. We had the chief economist from the Ontario Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Rural Affairs come to our public meeting in Madoc. He happens to be a farmer who has land nearby. But he made the point of coming out to listen to another economist, Ken Meter, talk about the state of agriculture in the region. And it was actually, started a very constructive conversation with him as the chief economist. And he shared all kinds of slides and data with us that we then brought into our analysis, and which then, provides the footing for whoever's going to work with those results. So, it's far from policy change. I'm not going to say that we've changed the world yet, but the kinds of relationships that we were building through this research project, I think, can lead to more impact than if either I as an academic or if Louise's organization on our own did these things separately. By working together, we have more clout.
Thank you, Peter. Anyone else want to tackle that topic, or? I see Bess's hand. Yes, please.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'd like to speak from the National Farmers Union perspective. As a young farmer, part of the reason why I joined the National Farmers Union was because of that political lens and the fact that they've spent the last 50 years looking at agricultural policy. And then the other part of that is understanding what's in place and then leading farmer voices and actually democratically deciding on how we can actively try and influence policy moving forward. Perfect example of that is with Farmers for Climate Solutions. The National Farmers Union actually has a meeting with our federal ag minister within the next couple of weeks. And through that, we're going to be putting forth some creative solutions for kind of related to this program, but for independent extension agrologists across the country to be able to, out of the private realm, be able to help farmers shift to agricultural practices. So the proposal is the Canadian Farm Rehabilitation Administration, which is a spinoff from the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration that kind of was put into place after the Dust Bowl to make sure that soil erosion and water resources and those things were taken care of. A similar experience, there was a bit of a mass exodus of farmland, farmland still being managed, but it's under fewer and fewer hands. And so, yeah, a proposal to have independent agrologists support farmers in shifting. And as we've talked about in here, our food system's not just about the production, there's many other aspects to that. And so just kind of making sure that we keep an eye on all aspects of farmer livelihoods and how to improve rural economics and farmer livelihoods in Canada. Thanks.
Thanks, Bess. Would anyone else like to take on this particular question? We have lots of others coming in and only so much time, but I want to give folks a chance to respond if they would like to before we go on. Any other panelists? Okay. Thanks. Those are both great answers and great points. I just want to go to a question that has been seconded and thirded in the Q&A, and so that is about hearing a little bit more about connections between farmers and Indigenous people in terms of solidarity networks. I think that was a particular response to Charles's presentation. But as someone mentioned in the chat, also there have been some relationships developing, Bess, in terms of your work in the Peace River area. So I'll leave it open if others want to comment as well, but perhaps I can turn it over to you first, Charles, to respond to that. Any other kind of additional thoughts about that that particular challenge and that theme that was raised in the paper that you talked about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky question to answer from my perspective because there isn't one answer to it. I think, you know, we need to think about like the scale at which we're talking and who we're talking with. So like I could give, you know, specific answers to how we do that in Northwestern Ontario, where I'm living and working right now. You know, whether it's we have the Indigenous Food Circle, which is a group that we, you know, sit together with and we have these conversations. A new Indigenous Food Sovereignty Collaborative that's formed in the region. You know, so but that's very specific to this context. I think there are regional examples, there's national examples maybe, you know, and there's international examples. You know, for those of you who are aware of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism for Relations with the UN Committee on World Food Security is a fantastic example. You know, Livia Campesina is another place where these happen. So at some level, I think, you know, part of the answer to that question is, you know, thinking about, you know, really, and this is where I think, you know, a systems perspective really comes in, that we need to make sure, you know, if we're talking about, you know, solidarity efforts, we need to be, you know, including not just Indigenous people, but also farm workers, you know, and groups that have been excluded from these conversations. And, you know, through some of the other research that I've been doing and projects I've been working on with different organizations and groups, I mean, it's, you know, these are the questions that continuously come up, is like, how are we engaging different people? How are we engaging with different groups? And also, how are people who look like me, who are white, you know, and male, stepping back and giving, you know, and you know, learning from others. And, you know, that's another big question I wrestle with in my day-to-day work and, you know, try to work with. So anyways, again, it's a good question. I think that in short, the answer is not, there's no universal answer to that. I think needs to be somewhat context specific. And yeah, lots of people need to be involved in it. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, just to go back to the field school, Charles, that was highlighted by some of the Indigenous presenters who participated, is also emphasizing, kind of de-emphasizing agriculture in terms of how we think about food systems primarily, that there are other forms of food provisioning, water, freshwater-based foods, and so on, across so-called Canada, that we need to think about in terms of how food systems do and can exist and advance, right? I think that I really liked that was. I really like that point was raised at the agroecology field school, as it has been raised elsewhere. And I think too that the point about agroecology possibly being in line with Indigenous food ways is also like a pretty powerful point that kind of comes back to that, which we don't typically think about agroecology as going beyond agriculture, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I want to extend it to Bess or any others. As Rosie said in the Q&A, any other specific example in terms of opportunities and specific avenues for any panelists that want to talk about possible solidarity networks with Indigenous peoples?
It's a big sorrow for us that we haven't had in Open Food Network those kinds of networks yet. But one of the things that we know about the networks we've had is that every one of them starts with one person. In our examples, they've always been women. And from there, that person builds out in their networks. And when there have been examples that have tried to start from a top-down reason, like it's someone's job to do the work, they fail. So there's something in that for us, that it starts with a person who sees a network beyond themselves right from the beginning. That's why they're starting it. So those are the people we kind of have feelers out for. We're looking for those people because we can work with you.
Thanks, Teresa. I thought Bess was about to say something and then I wasn't sure. Bess, did you want to go?
Yeah, I just want to say that my experience in the Peace region here is just having an open mind and an open heart. The successful connections I've had are from leading through example and sharing as a producer in the community that I am practicing agroecology practices, and having those Indigenous producers actually connect through a common connection to the land, and then being able to explore those conversations broader. I do know one particular friend and member and fellow producer has been working with government institutions to try and get some research and development going, and it can be difficult because it's a different language and it's a different system, and just trying to be able to lead from a land-based perspective, and then try and connect that to a system that communicates in a different way and uses different language. And so I can kind of speak to the challenges that kind of creates, but I can also speak to the power of just, again, having that open mind and open heart. There's been a number of Indigenous agricultural leaders in our community that are bubbling up and having a larger voice. And yeah, the most successful example and what I'm excited about is there's one of our local First Nations, Sotu First Nations. There's a young gentleman that actually went away and learned about agroecology and has now come back to his nation to not only have his own market garden and lead by example with food forests in his own land, but also working with the community to bring those practices broadly on their agricultural lands, which also has process issues coming from. And so it just kind of speaks to that system that we're trying to work within, and the challenges of communication from different perspectives and different levels. So thanks.
Thanks so much. We could talk for ages, I think, about all of these very large issues, but we only have a few minutes left. Before we wrap up, I want to try to sneak in one last quick question, and maybe I'll ask Peter and Louise, and perhaps David and Teresa, if you wanted to respond to this, and that is around, one of the themes in multiple questions has been around expanding and extending these kinds of opportunities for community-based research or community engagements between community and researchers, whether it's in the academy or beyond. it's tricky, I know. So any particular thoughts around challenges and opportunities for just doing more of what we've been talking about in largely in the Ontario context today?
Well, resources, of course, are the huge challenge. Even working in partnerships with academics, generally the community partner doesn't have the same resources and needs them. So I know Open Food Network globally has really been trying to look at this, and we have our own research consortium that we kind of are trying to move some of this research forward in. But it's being done by volunteers on volunteer basis is what's happening. So it's volunteer-based research. Yeah, so that's the challenge.
I think there's perhaps another sort of dimension too, just in terms of, like, we get approached by a lot of researchers around the world who are interested in the data, and how do we manage those kind of relationships and set up shared standards, establish like communities of trust, basically. And then I think the question of user data with the platform generally, like, there's some very interesting initiatives around data consortiums and data co-ops. So the idea, that would be a very interesting thing to explore further, I think. But the idea would be not just a question of protecting the data and data privacy, which understandably we're all in a bit of a defensive crouch when it comes to tech giants, but there's another side to it, which is data sovereignty. And that's what you choose to do with your data. How do you set up governance processes for data? There are plenty of farmers and plenty of folks in the agroecology and regenerative agriculture movements who I think would be totally open to sharing their data with research groups from universities and that kind of thing. So what are the mechanisms to put in place? And we started working with that on a smaller scale, just in terms of the practices that we have in place to work with other, just to work with the researchers that approach us, and to not get overwhelmed. That's the other thing. There's so many people coming forward with interest in it, that how do we manage that and can maintain open access to?
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's a big question, but any last quick comments, either Louise or Peter?
I know with the farmers here, they're often happy to have a student to come and do a research with them, because they see that that's a key part of their education. So, that's one side. But I think when you're going to, go in on a bigger scale, that, the farmers have to see a benefit to themselves. With the Quinty farm research and stewardship thing, I think the farmers, okay, they can share data, but they're going to get a feedback of the data, so that they're going to be able to use this to make decisions about their farm. So there has to be a proper feedback with the research. It shouldn't just be one way.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. Peter,
the word that maybe it's a good word to end on is relationships. Louise and I first had a conversation, I think it's well over 10 years ago, Louise. And then I had a student from one of my classes go and do some interviews in the county, and it just kind of built from there. And then when we had the opportunity to be part of a larger research project, Louise became a natural partner. And I said, what do you want to do with this opportunity? And we went for to talk to her board and so on. And it's the same answer to the questions we were having about connections between farmers and Indigenous people. It starts off by figuring out who some of those people are and going, as Bess said, with an open heart and having a conversation to see what you have in common and what can we do together, right? And so I encourage other farm groups across the country or wanting to work on research projects that could benefit their communities, to figure out who's at the local community college, who's at the university, that you think their work is of interest, read something they've written or said in the newspaper or whatever, and see if you can reach out to them. Everybody's home right now. Have a Zoom call and go from there.
Thanks, Peter. Great way to wrap us up. And this has been a very fruitful and interesting conversation. And I really appreciate you all for the presentations, to Bess for your responses and thoughts and insights. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. And I'm very glad that, given that this has been a great engaging and interactive conversation, that it has been recorded. As I mentioned at the top, it will soon be available on the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems YouTube page. And so once the recording is ready, and up on YouTube. You will get an email. All the registrants will get an email with that link. Amanda or Heather, I believe, is also putting a post-webinar survey in the chat box. And at the end of the webinar, I think a little box will click up also if you wanted to provide some feedback to help us make webinars better in the future. And that link will also go in an email for that survey. So thank you so much in advance for filling that out. For more information on Fledge, please follow us on Twitter @FledgeResearch and sign up for the newsletter by visiting the website, which is fledresearch.ca. Thanks again to Amanda and Heather for all of their work putting this together and their work behind the scenes. Thank you to our interpreters, Ronald Fournier and Yolande Chiasson, and to Mara Shah and the NFU for their support, and to the Feeding the City team. It wasn't just me that was helping to promote this webinar. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a great conversation. We are basically on time, and we will wrap up here and look forward to the next conversation. Best of